Noel, welcome to the Kantinegesprek.
Good morning, Angela. Nice to see you.
Yeah, we're quite happy that you would be one of the participants, and of course, I have some questions for you, but I would like to ask you to do a short introduction of yourself, if necessary. Most people know who you are, of course, and but still, it's nice for some others to hear all the stuff you're doing.
Well, I'm known as a promoter of naturalistic planting design, and particularly from a sort of evidence-based angle, believing that we can learn so much from plant ecology science about what we do in gardens and other designed landscapes. I'm also very interested in education. Many years ago, I taught in adult education, English as a second language to immigrants to Britain. And I sort of continued that interest in education, which is why over the past few years I've worked with a colleague, Annie Guilfoyle, who is a garden designer, but again has worked in adult education to run a whole series of live events and then webinars, really in order to disseminate and present information. One of my great worries is whenever some famous gardener dies, you know that when they go, all that knowledge goes with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of that knowledge was never written down or recorded. So I've always had a real interest in gathering and disseminating information. And I think that's something that crucially important. We sort of build up this body of knowledge that everyone can draw on.
Yeah, and especially nowadays with the internet, it's easy to
much easier. Yes, sure.
Get that information everywhere. Yeah,
yeah,
wonderful. Well, I'm especially interested, or we are, in how you would describe and pinpoint maybe the specifics of Dutch design, because you've been writing about Dutch design and designers for a long time now. But what makes us special?
Yeah, well, I think it's, I'm always interested in this borderline between the familiar and the unfamiliar. And obviously the Netherlands and Britain, or southern Britain, well, England really, let's say, rather than perhaps, have a very similar climate and of course a sort of common heritage in plants and a fantastic culture for growing. But plonk me in a Dutch garden and I always know I'm in a Dutch garden. I can always tell, and I'm kind of interested in those kind of subtle cues. And there's various things, but the thing I particularly like to home in on is it really goes back to Mean House. There's always that touch of the Bauhaus, that kind of modernist with a capital M, look to anything. To a lot of Dutch gardens, and it's things like the palette of plants may be exactly the same as what a British garden designer or gardener would have, but there's a kind of chunky graphic element which might be quite a small part of the whole thing, but it always makes it look really quite different to a British garden. I mean, British and Dutch gardeners across the whole number of gardeners, they are all kind of nostalgia freaks. I mean, gardening for most people is an activity about relaxing and being, which involve and a sort of certain relationship with romanticism and nostalgia, which I think from the two cultures come from different directions. For the British, it's a kind of idealized cottage garden.
Mm-hmm.
The Dutch, I think, is what I call the het low gene. It's that sort of Baroque formality, and you see these kind of little snippets of this formality again and again and again in so many Dutch gardens. That's the Dutch sort of traditionalism, whereas with the British, it's more it's a more relaxed, sort of idealized cottage garden romantic element. But I think the sort of the modernist post-Mina outlook is the one that I think is really quite interesting, because we never really had that in Britain. We never really had modernism in garden design.
Okay.
The whole sort of arts and crafts, Sissinghurst, Hidcote, Great Dixter, all of that was an incredibly successful look. But it's kind of acted almost as a cage. It's quite difficult for the British to sort of think their way out of that.
Okay, so it's like a kind of, is it like an order of things in the garden, or the straight lines, or?
Well, it's things like just having, it could be just one little box hedge that's perhaps not functioning necessarily as a hedge as such, but a simple graphic block.
Okay.
That sits in the garden and has a kind of a presence that is a sort of it's a hard defined presence, as opposed to the kind of softer, more informal planting perhaps, and perhaps doesn't necessarily relate to sort of classical formality. And that's one of the clever things about what Mean House did and her copyists is to introduce these elements of framework, of structure, but were somehow freed from all that classical right angles and framing, using these elements in a much freer way, I think, and that's what makes them modernist.
Okay. Yeah, and does it also have something to do with like the contrast between all the soft planting and these structural elements?
Yes. I mean, the English garden of the sort of arts and crafts did that very much with framing. You'd have these rooms, you'd have hedges, you'd have kind of, in that happened all this kind of informal frothy stuff, whereas the Dutch, it's more like having bones. It's more like having these elements which are kind of freer, floating, but nevertheless are a very good contrast to softer herbaceous planting.
Okay.
I mean, that's one of the things in the late 1990s, when I first met Piet Oudolf, and I saw quite a lot of his gardens and loads of photographs of what he had done. He did this quite a lot, and it's something he's moved away from. I think he's lost interest in it. He probably got bored with it, and indeed, there are limits as to what you can do with this in a temperate climate, partly because of the limitations of plant material, and also, of course, client expectations. People went to Piet Oudolf because they wanted perennials, not because they wanted box cut in a new way. But I think it's been a shame, because I think the British and the Americans, we didn't really have much of a modernist input into our garden traditions, and it's something that, particularly for contemporary environments, it's a good one to learn from.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that is the main influence of Dutch garden design on garden design worldwide?
Well, no. I mean, that's kind of. I mean, the main influence now is very much the kind of Oudolf-led perennial look. I mean, that is hugely influential. But I think it would be a real shame if it was limited to that. And I think, given that, just thinking about people in South America, Argentina, southern Brazil, Uruguay, these are countries where interesting garden design, planting design is really beginning to take off, partly because they have a fantastic herbaceous flora. But it would be a shame if all of that happened without being able to reinvent some of these more structural elements as well, especially since they will have all sorts of woody plant material that can be, no doubt, treated in this way that we can only dream of.
Yeah, right. Apart from Piet Oudolf, do you think there's and Mien Ruijs maybe, although she's not that well known abroad, I think?
No. Although, I mean, I think, no, it's a shame. People have heard about her, but there's so little about her in English. And obviously Leo Dundulloch's book is great. And whenever I talk to Leo, I said, when are we going to have the English version?
Yeah. So is he working on that?
Oh, I don't know. But I think it would have to be a digital. But I don't think we could do that. It would be impossible. It wouldn't be the money to publish it on paper. But have it as an e-version would be great.
Would be great. Yeah. So do you think that apart from Piet Oudolf and maybe Mien Ruijs, there are other Dutch designers that are having that kind of influence, or maybe another kind of influence internationally?
Not internationally yet. I mean, there are certainly some Dutch designers who are working in abroad. I mean, Tom de Witte, for example, as a sort of really does a lot of work for Piet, as well as having his own projects in the United States. And I know Nick Rosen has done quite a lot of work in China, which would be very interesting to hear about. And I've seen some of his work in Poland, which is interesting. But I think it would be very difficult to sort of get what Piet Oudolf has been done. So it's been such a huge achievement and such a big breakthrough that it would, as we say, a hard act to follow.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Which developments and changes in Dutch garden design have you witnessed in the past years?
Well, I have been doing a lot of, because I'm researching, I have been
on
contemporary Dutch garden designers. I've obviously seen quite a lot. I don't want to sort of pick one person and say, they have got something the others haven't. But I think it's, I think one of the key things really to take away is about small spaces, just of the nature of the country. One of those defining aspects for centuries of Dutch life has been working within smaller spaces than other more advanced cultures, and we saw this in the Golden Age in Amsterdam. That the role, the relationship between people and what they spend money on and space was very different in Holland as to what it was in France or Britain. And I think, this what happens in small gardens is, and I think a lot of other people have found contemporary Dutch small garden design really very interesting, and obviously that's hugely important, not just for private owners, but also for people, for landscape architects working in high density living environments. And that level as well. And I think it's got a long way to go. And I think there's the smaller the space, the more challenging it is to design it. And my limited experience of traveling in China and Japan, it makes me think, well, actually, we still have got an awful long way to go in terms of how we really make the most of these spaces.
Okay. So I was wondering, do you think there are any aspects of the field of the garden design that where you think garden designers in general, and maybe Dutch garden designers specifically, should focus on in the next few years?
Well, I think we've had various technological advances. I'm thinking of how we integrate plants and architecture. Green roofs have been an amazing success story. Green walls have been much more problematic. But I think when well done and well maintained, they can be an incredible addition to the urban environment. And one that, in fact, is not particularly unnatural. I mean, there are natural environments that are extraordinarily vertical, with an amazing array of plant life on them. So I think there's a lot to be, as we move into a world where more and more people are living, more people with more money are living in high density in environments, and will have therefore particular, want to create beautiful and relaxing and nourishing environments in really quite small spaces. Those technological advances, I think, are important to embrace. I think the whole business of layering plants, which is essentially a lesson from ecology of how you structure vegetation. So you go from trees, shrubs, larger perennials, smaller perennials, ground cover right at the bottom. All of that is very important. It's very important visually. It's very important in terms of biodiversity, maximising the amount of green in a space which in an urban area can play an important role in air filtering and reducing air pollution. All of that is very important to take on.
What we're seeing here is an increased interest in using native plants among cultivars. So mixing the both. Is that something you see happening elsewhere?
Well, the native plants issue is so much is dependent on kind of accidents of geological history. Northern Europe does not have a particularly rich flora. And other parts of the world have a much richer flora, but which can be very sort of patchy. So, I mean, one thing we have in Central and Northern Europe is an amazingly rich calcareous flora. So if we've got for green roofs or post-industrial situations, we have got a lot of really nice plants to play with, which interestingly, in North America, for example, they don't. The calcareous floras in the United States are nothing to get excited about in the way that they are for us. So it's weird how geological history is just given us sort of different hands to play with. And I think that there are real limitations to a North European flora in terms of its ornamental impact, which is why, amongst other historical reasons, we in Northwest Europe have tended to sort of fill our gardens with so much other stuff from other parts of the world. But if you look at somewhere else where naturalistic planting is taking off, it is almost entirely about using native plants. And in South America, in Australia, New Zealand, it is not just about a different style. It is really about using what is there locally. All sorts of reasons for that, which may be to do with nationalism or biodiversity, that's kind of natural, really, and it's all to the good.
Yeah, well, I think over here we have the luxury of having loads of plants and cultivars available.
Yes.
But in terms of biodiversity, I think designers are looking more and more towards native plants and using native plants, but still not solely native. Yeah. So do you think in regard to that, maybe the focus in the next coming years, what do you think the role of education will be, and of garden designers keeping themselves educated and inspired?
Well, of course, it's a huge field, particularly with plant knowledge. Plant knowledge is not a skill. Plant knowledge is like with a language, you have to learn the vocabulary, and there's nothing beats just kind of sitting down or walking around learning it, learning about plants. Now, education education does need to be continuing, and I think particularly with a field like garden design, where you do potentially have an enormous array of material to use, but also sort of continuing, we learn new things all the time, particularly once we start putting ornamental plants together and letting them compete. We're moving from horticulture into ecology, and things can play out very, very differently. And we're still learning a huge amount. We're still learning a lot about what happens when you allow plants to compete. So education, ongoing education is very important, which I think is a lead in to say that you're doing with your events. That's what you're doing, and that's what Annie and I are doing with Garden Masterclass. So that this continuing education is vitally important.
Yes, well, of course we agree on that, but yeah. Yeah. Education, and for us, it's inspiration too.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, you were already talking about garden masterclass.
Yes.
And this year was supposed to be the year you would be starting on mainland
Yes.
with some garden masterclasses. Maybe for the people watching this and listening, it would be nice to tell us something about what made you come to the mainland with the garden masterclasses and the goals you have.
In some cases, we wanted to have events that were, physically needed to be elsewhere. Like Annie organised an event with Olivier Philippi in the south of France, looking at Mediterranean and dry summer climate. But the obvious leap was to the Netherlands, because we, in horticultural terms, we are so close, and because of language, realistically, we could hold events in English. Although, in fact, with one event we were going to organise this year with Luc Engelhardt, we wanted that to be in Dutch, I think there's been a real pickup in interest, actually, in Dutch gardens in England, partly through, Gardens Illustrated magazine for the last 3 or 4 years have been featuring a lot of Dutch gardens, and I think that's really made people kind of take notice. They can grow other things than tulips, particularly with the small gardens, that Gardens Illustrated magazine has done some really good stuff on Dutch small gardens. So I think it's the Netherlands was the obvious country to come to start trying to do events, and also we knew that there was it's also geographically works, because the relatively small country with a high population density, people can get to things. France and Germany, people are much more kind of scattered, and it's more difficult, I think, to hold those kind of physical events.
So, why did you decide to keep the groups limited? Because I visited a garden masterclass in London last January.
Yes.
And there was like 300 or 400 people in the room.
That was, whose event was that? Was that
Thomas Reiner.
Oh, right. Yes, that was the Society of Garden Designers, I think.
Yeah.
Wasn't it? Yes, not one of our events. No. That's a lecture. A small group allows people the intimacy to ask questions, to ask detailed questions. It's much easier for people who don't feel like getting up in front of 300 people and asking a question. The small groups are important for that personal contact, particularly over the course of a day, which is what we were doing with the original idea of Garden Masterclass, was to have one-day workshops that be together for sort of, say, 6 hours or so. And people really value that opportunity to ask questions of somebody, and to sort of ask supplementary questions, and to really perhaps engage with other people in a discussion. Whereas a big event, it's a spectacle, and can only be a spectacle.
Yeah, it was, but it was presented as a masterclass. So
yes.
When I got there, right. It was it was a surprise.
You didn't expect the other 290 people.
No, not really. No. Okay, talk about expectations. What can we expect from Garden Masterclass next year?
We are rescheduling all the events we were going to hold, including, we hope, 2 days with Luc Engelhardt, and hopefully some other events in the Netherlands. So all those live events. More webinars. The webinars have proved really successful. They're brilliant for a global audience. And that works both ways, that we can pull in people from all over the world. so that, I mean, Hokkaido in northern Japan, for example, which is a kind of real growth area in terms of interesting perennial gardens, yet quite a difficult place to get to, and a not dissimilar climate to ours, a lot cold, a lot longer winters, but same suite of plants. Some interesting things going on there. Fantastic that we can have the experience of seeing what they're doing, and vice versa. So yes, lots more webinars. We're also wanting to develop what we call virtual garden tours, which is to have a sort of format, probably a video, where people will have the opportunity to look at a gallery of really fantastic photographs, with a commentary, an audio commentary by the owner, or an interview with the owner.
Yeah.
We have this phenomenon whereby a photographer will go to a garden and shoot, I don't know, a whole lot of images, and then they go to a magazine art editor who picks out about 5 and uses them, and one of those they get the wrong way around, and the photographer's always so fed up. Well, why didn't they use this? And I've got all these pictures, and this is an opportunity to actually use a much bigger part of that picture set.
Yeah.
And it's a way for photographers we work with to enable them to diversify their income, and it's really very difficult now. The amount of money that photographers get paid has just plummeted in real terms over the last 20 years. Now we are so used to, you know, really very high quality images in books and magazines, but the financial basis for doing that is just getting, you know, really thin, and we need to invent new ways to, you know, communicate beautiful and inspirational and functional gardens to people, and I see this as, you know, we need to work out new ways of doing this.
And you already mentioned your book.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, this was something I dreamed up with Maaike de Ridder, who of course just has photographed in such an enormous range of Dutch gardens and seems to know absolutely everybody. And we thought we would do something that really tried to relate, that was about some contemporary Dutch garden designers, but I've also, because I've been such a regular visitor to the country and I'm very interested in history, I've been absolutely fascinated by Dutch landscape history. And I think this is a story that needs to be more widely told, because it's about, you know, the relationship between humanity and their environment, and the creation of a landscape that in many ways is very artificial, but has increasingly begun to create spaces for nature, and some really spectacular recreated habitats, for example. And I find that the sort of dialectical relationship between sort of humanity, organization, engineering, and nature a very interesting one. I mean, the garden is a sort of a nexus, a meeting point of nature and culture.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's one reason why a lot of us actually find the garden a philosophically interesting space, because it's where nature meets culture. And you could say that the Netherlands is kind of an extreme example of where nature and culture meet in sort of global historical terms, because of the extreme nature of the environment and the measures taken over the last 1,000 years to make this essentially inhospitable environment into one that people can live at a surprisingly high density. And one of the contributors to the book, Peer van der Heijden, said to me, "Oh, Holland is a garden." Yeah, that's right in a way. And so what we're now doing is looking at landscapes, and looking at gardens and making some links between them, trying to see gardens in terms of that wider context.
Yeah, sounds interesting. Yeah. So when can we expect the book?
Hopefully sometime next year. You never know with publishers, but next year. I hope it's.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll keep you
Okay.
posted. We'll let you know when it's out, and you can perhaps give us some publicity. And
Yeah. Would be nice. Yeah. Maaike de Ridder is also on our list of potential guests, so that would be nice.
She's a very interesting person, as well as being a very good photographer.
Yeah, she is. Yeah. Well, I'm through with my questions. So, is there anything else you would like to say?
Well, no, sort of, good luck with this. It's a great initiative you're doing this, and I look forward to working with you. It's great for people to travel between our countries and see what we're doing, but increasingly we're able to do that virtually as well. Look forward to more fruitful communication.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you,
and well, we'll be in touch.
Yeah, marvelous.
Thank you.
All the best.